Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final webinar of this four-part series of Meet the Researchers. These are events that have been created by the Alumni and Development Team in partnership with the Centre for Immersive Technologies. Over the course of this series, we've been meeting researchers who are working with state-of-the-art virtual and augmented reality technology here in Leeds. My name is Faisal Mushtaq. I'm an associate professor in the School of Psychology and the Associate Director for the Centre for Immersive Technologies. And I'm your host for this evening and have been for the series, a series where we've covered a diverse range of content, covering some of the biggest issues facing society today. In the last three webinars, which if you haven't caught them, they are on YouTube and we'll be sending you some links to access them. We've covered healthcare, education, and cultural engagement. And tonight we're focusing on pro-environmental behaviours. And the common thread across all of these areas, it's a wide variety of topics, is how these new, truly transformative technologies, AR, VR, XR, which really seem to be the future of human-computer interaction, are being applied to solve some of the biggest challenges in society today. And the mechanism by which we're doing this in Leeds is the Centre for Immersive Technologies, which is a cross-cutting interdisciplinary research centre that since its launch in 2019 has become established as a pioneer in high-quality, responsible and critical research on immersive. And tonight you're going to be hearing about some of the really powerful ways in which these technologies are being used to promote behaviours for societal good. And before I introduce our speaker for this evening, I need to go through some technical points around the way that we'll structure this session. So first thing to mention is that there's plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentation, but you can post your questions at any point this evening. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens throughout the webinar. And you can also upvote other people's questions. So if you see something that actually you wanted to have answered, you would hear our speaker talk about that, then you can upvote, and hopefully that will move up the priority list, and we'll try and get to that within time. We also have some pre-submitted questions, so thank you to those people who have already entered those. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible as well at the very end. And then finally, the webinar is being recorded, as have our previous three. So if anybody does need to leave early, don't worry, we'll have the recording shared with you in the coming few days. So that brings me on to introducing our final speaker for this webinar. Is Catherine Graves. So Catherine is a PhD student from the School of Earth and Environment and the Priestley International Centre for Climate. She's previously worked in sustainability operations and research roles in the university, and she's recently been working on COP26 project on climate change education. So very, very timely right now. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from you, Catherine. I'm sure everybody else this evening is too. So I'm going to hand the screen over to you, Catherine.
Thanks ever so much, and thanks everyone. It's so interesting to see people from all over the world. A bit daunting, but so glad to have you. So yes, as Faisal said, I'm Catherine. I'm a PhD student in the School of Earth and Environment and the Priestley International Centre for Climate Change here in Leeds. So my research explores psychological barriers to pro-environmental behaviour change, and I specifically look at how virtual reality can be used to overcome these barriers to change. So for this talk, I'll start off by giving an overview of what pro-environmental behaviour is, and then I'll discuss how VR is being used and explore the effectiveness of it to overcome these barriers. I'm trying to use the screen. There we go. So start off with, what is pro-environmental behaviour change? So pro-environmental behaviour change can be both conscious and unconscious changes you make to your lifestyle, which has a positive impact on the environment. So some are fairly easy to classify as the positive change, such as swapping driving for public transport or walking and cycling, but others can be more complex. So food is a much trickier area. So generally, it's always going to be better for the environment if you eat less or no meat. However, if this leads you to then buy more vegetables and you might be lacking good cooking practice or nutritional literacy, this could then actually lead to increased food waste, which could then have a net loss of the environment compared to your previous, less wasteful but meat eating habits. So as you see, it's a complex web of behaviours that interact. So generally the advice you hear, which is kind of switching your energy supplier to a renewable one, eating less meat, giving up the car, walking, cycling, these will always have a positive impact. But it's just interesting to be aware of potentially new behaviours that arise. So this is called the rebound effect, where one altered behaviour causes another potentially more harmful behaviour. An example of this could be if you buy a hybrid car because you want to lower environmental impact, and then you end up driving it a lot more when it's using petrol than your previous car. So this is a rebound effect where the positive is then negated by this new behaviour. It's not always negative though, so because there's evidence that spillover behaviours happen. This is where one altered behaviour, such as eating less meat, then has positive effects on other types of behaviour. So that could be an increased awareness of food waste or an interest in buying local produce, that kind of thing. So that's spillover behaviours, where one positive thing creates more positive change. So to illustrate quite how tricky it can be to know what to do and know what the right thing to do is, we've just got a quick carbon quiz on the Zoom polls. If Kathleen could pull up the poll, please. Great. So where you can vote on the Zoom poll which product you think has a bigger carbon impact. So the first one we've got is, what do you think has the biggest impact, a cup of coffee or a bar of chocolate? Just give you just 10 seconds just to vote on which you think has a bigger carbon impact. And then we'll see the answer. I'll see how everyone's voted. Oh, wow, that's incredible, 50-50. So the answer is chocolate, but you would be very right. It is a very close call. So in terms of the range of impacts that a bar of chocolate could have can be quite wide. So although the average bar of chocolate, it has a bigger carbon footprint than a cup of coffee, that you can get low impact chocolates that would be then less than a cup of coffee. So it's quite complicated. So if we could pull up the second poll. What's the biggest carbon impact? And watching an hour's TV on a 32-inch LCD flat screen, very specific, or eating one banana? Just another few seconds on what you think. And then once we've had most people voting, we could bring up the results. That's interesting. Yes, so still pretty close, but yeah, 64% of you, absolutely right. So on average, obviously it can vary for a variety of reasons, but an hour's TV will generate 88 grams of CO2 compared to 80 grams of one banana. So still fairly close and still fairly low impact. So for the next poll, we've got buying a paperback book or buying a bottle of wine, which now I realise it sounds like a great evening, to be honest. But anyway, give you a few seconds to vote.
Probably being a little bit slow on this one, Catherine.
Yeah, it's not working for me actually. It comes up with an error. I don't know if that's happened to other people. It's Zoom just, there we go.
Okay.
There we go, that's working. Everyone should be able to do it now. No worries. So just a few more seconds. What do we think? Amazing, another 50-50. I mean, everyone's doing really well, to be honest, because I'm being very mean, and all of them so far have been very similar. So it's the most impactful one is the bottle of wine. So, but they're very similar. So wine is 1.04 kilograms and a paperback book is 1 kilo. So yeah, fairly similar. And just the final one. So we've got a return plane journey from London to Glasgow, which is very prescient as COP was just in Glasgow, or a new Land Rover. few more seconds. What do we think? Oh, that is interesting. It's actually a new Land Rover, and that's the one which is quite a significant difference. So the return flight is 500 kilos and the new Land Rover is 35 tons. So that's a bit of a difference, but obviously we're both of them fairly high emitting activities. So that worked better than I even anticipated in showing just how complicated kind of understanding all of this is, and how the calculations can often be complicated as well. So thank you everyone for contributing to that. So a big part of our collective aim as researchers and as citizens to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions as a society relies on effectively communicating the risk of changing climate, as well as communicating how individuals, society as a whole, organisations and governments can tackle this problem at different scales. So now I want to move on to talk about, there we go, the carbon quiz. So to what you think, what are the barriers that affect you from changing behaviours like we've talked about already? So what prevents you from making changes to your lifestyle? And there's absolutely no judgment here. We all deal and have to manage with the same pressures, and you know, everyday life can be challenging. It's often quite difficult to be able to make these changes. So I want to ask you just to think for a few seconds and write down in the chat what you feel impacts your behaviour or your ability or willingness to change behaviour. So this could be in the context of anything environmental. So like I've mentioned before, all of the things we should be doing. So eating less meat, driving less, using public transport, turning the heating down, you know, the sort of thing. I just be really interested to hear your perspectives and your experiences. I want to see if any common themes come out of your experiences. Scott's saying convenience straight off the bat. It's great. It's really interesting. Let's see if anyone else agrees. Exactly. Poor public transport is something I battle with very regularly in Leeds. I just see Penny just posted that to hosts and panelists. So I just say Penny posted into poor public transport, and just be aware everyone that to post in the chat, where it says to, make sure you are posting to everyone because it defaults to hosts and panelists. More ideas coming in. COVID, that's a really good point. Yeah. Habit, conflicting information. That's super interesting, and we will come on to that later. Cost. So Emma said cost, as well as Karine. Budget is important. Absolutely. Some more people agreeing with the cost. Yeah, definitely. We've had Jing, who posted saying near location for busing or walking. So that's access issues there. That's really important. Thank you, everyone. So there's quite a few people agreeing on the cost front, convenience, infrastructure. Let's see, I tried to guess ahead of time what you might be saying. So we've got a couple of suggestions on the slide. So yeah, convenience, definitely. Cost, yes. A lot of the structural factors that you've identified. So we sometimes divide these factors that affect behaviour into external and structural factors, like you've identified with poor public transport and other things like that. And that can be kind of structural, so policy, regulations, those high level top down behavioural factors. There's also the psychological and the internal factors. So they're stuff like our values, our emotions, our habits, and our interpretation of information, which I think was mentioned earlier, and peer group influences. John has just written in the group. So social factors can often lie somewhere between external and internal factors, because you've got social pressures, norms, and culture can sometimes kind of lie between the two. So yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you, everyone. So some things which you've identified, so they're determinants of behaviour. So that's awareness and dealing with information and your values, things like that. And some of them are what we call psychological barriers. And that's where my research focuses. So psychological barriers are understood as factors within the behavioural mechanism that we all work within. So this prevents a different or a new behaviour from occurring. So this could be acquiring new knowledge, but this doesn't then translate into behaviour change due to an existing emotional attachment, for instance. So a good example I like to use for this is around the reluctance to reduce meat consumption due to attachment to Sunday dinners or key cultural events, which often have a big association with specific foods. So something that I'm exploring specifically within my research, because it's a big element of the assumed benefit of VR for pro-environmental awareness and action. And this is psychological distance. So psychological distance essentially contains 4 components in distance, which prevents pro-environmental behaviour change happening. So the first one of these, this is social distance. So that's the distance we feel between ourselves and others. The second one is spatial distance. So that's geography, essentially. The third one is called uncertainty, and it's a bit more nebulous, a bit harder to define, but it can include uncertainty around the information presented, which Lorna identified in the chat. Uncertainty about how we respond to that information and how we respond to climate change, or it could be uncertainty about how we should behave. So that's where social norms come in. And the fourth element of psychological distance is temporal distance. So this is a common issue in communicating climate change. So it's the assumption that we're looking at climate changes which will occur in 20, 50 or 100 years time, whereas people from small island states, low-lying countries, sub-Saharan Africa, among others, will tell you that it's definitely happening now. So it's a common misconception, but it's still very present in the challenges faced when communicating climate change is getting across that urgency. So relating to this to VR, because it's interesting because VR brings distant or otherwise difficult to experiences and images closer to us. So I argue in my research that both behavioural determinants and psychological barriers to behaviour change need to be considered equally when designing interventions for pro-environmental behaviour. So what do I mean when I talk about behavioural interventions? In order to shift behaviours to be more in line with planetary limits, behavioural interventions can be one of the strategies we apply. So this can include large-scale direct cost policy, such as the plastic bag charge that happened in the UK a few years ago. So this had a significant and immediate impact on plastic bag consumption. But it can also include smaller, what we call nudges. And this can include strategies such as very kind of subtle strategies, such as how a supermarket shelf is arranged that affects purchasing behaviours. It can also include adding carbon offsetting to flights as a default option, with people having to then opt out instead of opting in. And something in discussion at the moment is voluntary carbon labelling on menus and food products in shops. So VR is a type of behavioural intervention, and that can happen both in research and in practice in the wider world, whether there is an intended behavioural outcome associated with that or not. So moving on to how VR is used in practice. So VR has been increasingly used in journalism over the last few years. So New York Times, Vice, National Geographic, BBC, Earth have a huge range of, especially kind of 360-degree videos and films, as well as other media outfits are increasingly using VR. So this is a picture from a New York Times piece. The UN and the World Bank have produced VR content to use as a political communication tool. And there's also a whole host of documentary style content online focusing on climate and environmental issues, which is just kind of publicly accessible. So I'll just show you a couple of clips from 2 VR films now. They take different approaches in what they are aiming to do, what message they're trying to send. And then we can talk more about how these work and how effective they might be as a behaviour change tool. So while I get the films up and while they're playing, I'd be interested to hear what you think and feel, what arises when you're watching them. So please, again, just as you did before, just jot a few words down in the chat, just thinking about what these clips provoke in you, what thoughts and feelings they provoke. And I will try and get the videos up now. Okay. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, it should be working. Hopefully you can see that. And just play a few seconds from this. This is the first clip is from the UN Environment Programme, and it's called Meet Your Carbon Footprint. Just a few seconds of this one. Okay, that's the first one, just a few seconds of that. And the second clip, which I'll get up now, is from an organisation called Wild Immersion, and this is just their introductory video, but it just takes a bit of a different approach from the UNEP one. I'll try and... Oh. Okay, and I'll try and stop sharing. There we go. Brilliant, thank you, Kathleen. I'll just... Oh. Okay, great. Thanks, Kathleen. So there's just two very quick examples of how VR is being used as a campaigning and a behaviour change tool. I see Jing posted in the chat, again, just so everyone can see, make sure that when you're posting in the chat, you're posting it to everyone because it's defaults to hosts and panelists. So Jing identified that they were promoting eco-friendly behaviour from government or researchers, influence behaviour that has some contribution from the individual. So yeah, that's identifying the individual role in that. John says that no, the first one was an infographic on steroids, primitive but potentially promising. Yes, I would agree with you. And Karine says the first one was nice but a bit confusing when losing the walls. The second was nice to see all the animals in nature. Yeah, so the role of nature in VR is a common theme in all environmental and climate related VR really. And you could kind of see the appeal in terms of bringing these exotic, often distant experiences closer to try and bridge that gap that we talked about earlier. Confusing the first one, second one was nice. Yeah, the first one is, I only gave you a snippet of it because it's a bit long, it's a 4-minute video, but I'll post the link later if you want to go and watch it in full. So yes, it is a bit more primitive in the fact that it's you've got text on a screen, so it's not kind of real life, it's a curated environment essentially, but I like it because it's relatable in terms of you can imagine yourself sat in your kitchen and looking at your breakfast. That's what I like about it. But yes, I can definitely understand why it's a bit confusing how this kitchen just turns into a flooded environment. It is a bit odd, but I would recommend going and having a look at the full video. So that's interesting in terms of what you're saying and how you're interpreting that content. So what's on the screen now is just a very brief indicator from just seeing Adrian's message about no apparent message. That's a really good point, which I'll come on to later, and happy to talk about more at the end in the Q&A about the messaging of a lot of the environment and climate content created. So yes, just as I say, this is a very brief indicator from our ongoing research, where half of the participants in our current experiment that's running at the moment experienced some climate related VR content, and then they were asked to describe their thoughts and feelings, just as I asked you to do just now. So this is a quick, very blunt illustration of their responses. But as you can see, the most frequently used word was sad, and there are others. The other words there include words like destroying, change, nature, beautiful, feeling. So it's all quite emotive language. And I think kind of you identified quite a lot of that in your comments. It wasn't the same film, it was a film around deforestation in the Amazon. So they identified the key concepts in the film very astutely, as the words meat, deforestation, nature, eating all appear frequently, and they all identified how interrelated these environmental and climate issues are. So like I say, VR has become a popular tool for NGOs like the UN Environment Programme from the first video showed. The charities, media and other organisations also increasingly using VR. However, the analysis of the effectiveness of VR as a pro-environmental behaviour change tool only expanded very recently. But as you might have seen and heard from previous talks, it's got a bit of a longer history in other research areas such as medicine and transport. So what does the research say? Is VR effective? Does it work? So like some of you identified in the chat, the VR clips provoked some emotions in you, and some of the factors of cognition that we identified earlier. So this is what VR is really good at. It has the wow factor still. So what can VR do? It's very good at generating empathy for social and environmental issues. There's an interesting study which explores homelessness, and it's found that the participants who experienced homelessness themselves in the VR experience were significantly more empathetic to the issue. I know it's not a climate example, but it's a good indicator of how VR can be used for good. And how this empathy is actually generated is interesting. So it involves a key factor, what we call presence. So presence is essentially how effectively we are transported into that virtual world. It can be measured, it can be a technical measure, but it can also be a behavioural one, as it's been found to significantly impact on the empathy generated, and also how long information is retained. VR has mainly been found to be effective at raising awareness of environmental and climate impacts. So within this process of raising awareness, information communication is important, but it isn't the only thing that matters, and I think sometimes that gets lost. So what aren't we so sure about yet in terms of how VR works? So although VR is very good at raising awareness, communicating information and generating empathy, there isn't actually that much evidence yet of it translating into subsequent behaviour change. So the focus of the research area so far, because it's fairly new, it's been focusing on small scale behaviours. So a couple of examples of this includes a study which recorded the temperature and the volume of water used by participants to wash their hands after an experiment, or another study which counted how many paper towels were used to mop up a spilled glass of water. So these studies are very well designed and they're very important steps in building our knowledge of the effectiveness of VR. But if you're only measuring that very small scale behaviour, you've got limited scope to then extrapolate it and kind of gain greater, bigger learning from it. So research has also focused in a similar vein on low impact behaviours. So by low impact behaviours, I mean actions which then have a lower climate or environmental impact. So recycling, and the classic one is changing your light bulbs. But this is very understandable really, as behavioural studies, as I've found out, are very hard to conduct logistically, as it's quite tricky to observe people in natural settings outside the lab, essentially. And again, because it's difficult to carry out research over time, the current research focuses on fairly short timescales. So we don't know how long the impact of the VR experience lasts. And importantly to me, if we think back to earlier when we discussed, and you all contributed in the chat, the huge array of factors which affect our behaviours and those barriers that you identified which can prevent change, you'll notice that awareness and empathy only cover a small portion of the factors that we discussed earlier. So, and the barriers which you all identified in your own lives, such as our existing habits, their costs, other resources and infrastructure, they've not been examined in great depth yet across the research. So from this research, that I believe in order to design effective VR experiences and also content which helps people overcome their barriers to change, all of these factors which we've identified need to be considered, else you're only ever dealing with one small part of the process. So I advocate for a holistic understanding of behaviour change being applied to both the research that we do and also practice. And I just want to have a slight tangent and a note on ethics of VR. So as we discussed earlier, one of the benefits of VR is its ability to bridge the distance between people and issues, but this can raise some ethical problems, especially in relation to social and environmental issues. The VR content can be quite provocative, it's often quite emotive and hard-hitting. So there's a duty of care as practitioners and as researchers to balance the need for not to influence the natural responses caused by VR, but we also don't want to cause undue distress. And there is a risk of this when we are transporting people to different situations, locations in VR, which could potentially be shocking, upsetting, or even scary sometimes. So I think more work needs to be done developing good ethical practice for using VR, both in research and in practice. So just to wrap up, we know that VR has the potential to bring distant impacts and experiences close to the individual. And this has been found to lead to increased awareness and empathy. And therefore, we hope a greater willingness to act and change behaviour. However, we just don't know how this translates and the mechanism behind the behaviour change yet. And also just want to leave you with, I know you've had time throughout this talk to think about your own barriers, and we've unpacked them a bit and peeled behind the initial layers. I just want to challenge you to pick a barrier you mentioned and think about what you can do to overcome it. So I've got some resources, which I'll just linger on them, because if people want to watch back, then they can get the info. But yes, thank you very much for listening and coming along. Here are my contact details. I'd be happy to talk about anything we've discussed or anything virtual reality and proenvironmental behaviour, basically. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for a fantastic presentation. Oh, it was was really undecided with some of those points that you brought up in the beginning. It's kept on hovering over both of those options.
I couldn't
So
believe how
hard to
many
know.
50-50s we had.
Yeah, I know. That was a little bit more comforting for me because I thought, oh, maybe I'm the only one who doesn't know.
I mean, I had to look it up, so absolutely no judgment.
That was great. Yeah, thank you so much for that presentation. So we've got some questions coming in already, and we also have some pre-submitted questions as well that I promised to get to. So I'm going to kick off first of all with a question. I'm sure I don't know who submitted this, but it's an excellent one. So how do you navigate around using immersive technologies to drive action without creating a sense of environmental doom and burnout?
That's a really good question. And I think we've found over the last few years, there's been a real awareness of how the doom and gloom has maybe been used in climate communications previously. And I think there is a bit of a move away from that towards kind of hope and being able to give a feeling of agency, because a lot of what we're talking about, especially kind of a key foundation of psychological distance, is those distant impacts and those distance between our own actions and the impacts that occur. And I think any sense of agency that we can give will then help and bridge that distance and bring those a bit closer. So I think VR has a real possibility in that. And I think there was a comment in the chat actually, which I wanted to come back to because it kind of linked quite nicely. I can't see it at the moment, but I'll just scroll up. Oh, I can't see where it's gone. But yes, it was about doom and gloom and hope. In terms of the that was it. It was about the messages in the VR clips that I showed being quite confusing, and that's I think a criticism I have of a lot of the environmental VR content that's out there, is that there's a lot of incredible experiences that you can see in VR. Amazing. I've spent more hours than I would care to admit in Google Earth in VR, because it's amazing, that you can travel around and see these incredible places that I wouldn't ever be able to see normally. But and there's a lot of environmental communications from NGOs and charities that utilize the kind of the sense of awe and wonder that those can bring. But in terms of having a specific message, that's often not there. So then people, then you can be left after you see that VR with, this is incredible, I am so small in this universe, but what can I do? And there's never the what can I do? So we need to be able to go forward and build that agency in and be able to have better, more effective messaging in those communications, to be able to give people a sense of that they can do things about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Karen. That is really interesting, this sort of idea of agency and sort of using VR for that. On a related note, Adrian asks, what are the opportunities of VR to show the viewers the consequences of the viewer's own home or place of work? And I guess that really hammers home the sort of agency sort of argument.
Absolutely. That's a really good question, Adrian, and I would love to see some content that enabled that. I don't know of any currently. I know of VR is being used kind of increasingly in the development sector and around kind of architecture, infrastructure projects, things like that. And I think it's definitely been primarily being used to vision future scenarios and things like that. I would love to see something at such a personal level, exploring your own impact and being able to see that in lifetime. I don't know if you know of anything, Faisal, but I'm not sure of anything at the moment, but I think that would be a game changer.
Yeah. So something similar, not exactly the same, Adrian, but in healthcare, one of the things that we've been exploring for rehabilitation, particularly for sort of patients who so maybe have had a sort of fall or stroke rehabilitation sort of process in the hospital, exploring whether we can sort of bring their home to the hospital while they're doing the physiotherapy using virtual reality. Now, of course, that's not a dynamic thing. It doesn't sort of show how things are going to change over time, but the possibility of bringing your own home into VR to accelerate sort of or promote behavior in a particular way is starting to gain traction, and that's probably where most of that sort of success is going to come from. In rehab, it's a very similar thing. It's about agency and sort of self-efficacy that ultimately drives recovery, and making that sort of bespoke experience is definitely the way forwards. On that note, I'm going to take a liberty here, sort of being host, and ask you a question, Catherine, which is around this very topic of individual sort of characteristics and how you've sort of taken those into account. So you talked about psychological distance, and sort of so clearly, in cases people rely on some spectrum for that in your experiments as well. So are there individual characteristics you can define, and sort of these people are more amenable to behavioral change, and tailor your sort of experiences in that way?
It's a really good question. And when I was designing my experiments, I initially wanted to have a measurement for all of the characteristics that I could ever think of in terms of the factors that affect behavior. Ended up slimming it down slightly. But one thing that I was very sure about including was I guess there's a few. So there are measures of agency and self-efficacy, like you say, that there are some specific measures related to environmental issues that you can explore, and also something called perspective taking propensity scale, which is a characteristic that is used across VR research. But something I was quite interested in specifically is the connection to nature characteristic. So partly because of the volume of VR content that's out there, focusing on nature and using nature as a proxy, as a tool to engage people with environmental issues. And that has proven to have a direct correlation in terms of people's willingness to, and behavioral intention, essentially, and willingness to change. So it does show that there is evidence behind the volume of content and work that has gone into creating these nature-based experiences. So that's something I would kind of like to highlight. It's quite interesting. And I think kind of the last couple of years with COVID, especially, I think nature has been a bit higher on everyone's agenda than it might have been before. So it's maybe even more interesting going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Adrian, for that original question. So Corinne asks about your experiments, a bit more detail on that. So what sort of age range do you sort of test, and where have these experiments taken place?
Thank you, Corinne, for your question. So basically, it's not a representative study, but we have 100 participants from across the UK. And there are a variety of ages, honestly, more spread across the age groups than I was anticipating, which is great. So it was an online study because of COVID, the research went online, which has actually been brilliant, because being able to get probably a bigger sample size than I would have been able to in Leeds, which was my original plan. So yeah, it's not a representative sample, but it is more spread across kind of your standard participant characteristics than I might have got otherwise. So it's actually been a bit of a silver lining for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Corinne. Actually, on that point of how old participants are, I just want to flag some other related work. And Catherine, I don't know if we've ever spoken about this. Liam Taylor's work in geography, who's been looking at climate change and sort of going into primary schools to look at and demonstrate some of the impact using virtual reality. I'll link to that in the chat for people to sort check out. So it's targeting that younger age group where some of those beliefs around sort of sustainable behaviours are being developed, and that's sort of potentially a place where this could be sort of ripe for longer term sort of interventions.
Absolutely. Sorry, I
Yeah,
just wanted
no,
to
carry on.
lead on from that really, and something just as we talked about earlier in terms of the moving away potentially from the doom and gloom kind of approach and framing around climate communications to more one moving towards hope and agency and self-efficacy. And I think kind of young people over the last few years have really driven that. And just with my other hat on, in my climate education hat, just wanted to kind of flag that and kind of acknowledge it really. In terms of COP26, the outcomes would have been very different, worse, if young people hadn't been as vocal and as much a voice as they do now, thankfully.
Yeah. So our anonymous attendee actually sort of wants to flip that around, this question here, and sort of talk about whether VR really shifts the responsibility to tackling climate crisis to the individual, and really it's the governments and corporations, as you sort of mentioned with sort of COP, who should be taking a lead on this. And so the idea is that they can deliver the biggest possible impacts rather than individuals. So how does that fit with your sort of philosophy to this sort of research?
Absolutely, and really great question and point. I can't remember if I ended up putting it in. I meant to put in a picture with the placard of system change, not climate change, because I would 100% agree that the push from some governments across the world and some large corporations to focusing on individual actions is really damaging and absolves them of responsibility, which they really should be taking. So it's something I struggle with in my research, to be honest, is very fundamentally believing that governments and large corporations need to be leading, but also knowing the power that VR could have, and really believing in the potential that it has to be able to give people the agency to change their behaviour. And there is a lot of evidence to support purchasing power is huge, and kind of other behavioural mechanisms within that the individuals can enable to push governments and corporations. But I would 100% agree with you in terms of where the responsibility lies.
Yeah, just on that, I sort of add another sort of perspective to this. So some of the work that some of you will have heard last week, where Mark Williams and Maya Shahali were talking about the work happening in Bradford, and data visualization of sort of interventions and sort of children who are most at need, has been used as a decision-making tool for local and sort of ultimately it's going to be sort of central government to help them understand the impact. There's sort of real sort of influencers and sort of decision makers. So a way of sort of, just as easily as this could be used by your average Joe, Boris Johnson could well be sort of be targeted in this sort of way with these types of interventions, right? So great. We actually
sorry, I just come back. It just reminded me with that comment is that, like I mentioned earlier, the UN VR content was created as a political communication tool. So it was literally created to put the headsets on politicians going to UN conferences. And they had, it's quite hard to measure how effective it was. But, anecdotally, they said that, if people are, I think linking to a question that's come in around hearts and minds as well, which I can come to later. You have to, if people have that face when they're in the VR headset of wow, then you have to hope that somewhere along the line that has had an impact.
Yeah, great. Well, let's go to John's question now. It's actually John. Where's John from? John's from Arizona. Yeah. Hi, John.
Amazing.
So in fact, one of our previous questioners, Adrian's from Connecticut, and then we had Karine as well. So where's Karine from? Santiago, Chile. Wow. So truly globally relevant presentation today. So John asks, about sort of the problem of ideologically motivated citizens and whether VR can make a unique contribution there, changing hearts and minds. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely agree. I think statistically, climate denial is tiny among the general population, but definitely, I mean, across the world that may be different. The ideologically motivated citizen is a really interesting way of putting it. I very much believe that VR, it does target the heart. I think if one of my favorite things is to put a VR headset on someone and see how they react, because it's very emotional sometimes, especially with environment and climate content. I think it is possible. I wonder how the unique contribution, the part of that question, I wonder about that. I think the evidence is probably still out on kind of where the added value is, but in terms of the quantifying it, because anecdotally it's definitely there. In terms of climate denial, I wish I had an answer to that. I think as we see, certain communications are fairly ubiquitous and they reach across the board, across a range of, across the spectrum around political ideology, interests, values. I mean, I don't know, because we've got such a worldwide audience, how relevant this anecdote would be. But there's things like Blue Planet, which kind of appeal to a really wide audience. So I think if communication styles like that can have an effect, then I think VR, it has a potential. I guess it's not been around long enough to be able to explore that on a wide enough scale, because it is looking at the individual. But yeah, I've not seen any research which specifically targets climate denialists. But I would be really interested in that. I'll have a look out. Maybe I can send a link if I dig something out, and we can send it on later.
Yeah, that's interesting, and sort of fits with that sort of idea of individual sort of characteristics determining this. I have an apology for Catherine and Kareem. Sorry, guys. So it's Kareem is from Guatemala, and it's Catherine who's from Santiago. So more sort of varied. So that reminded me, because Catherine just posted in there, we are part of the system. We elect governments, we elect leaders, and we buy products from companies. So everything is connected here. Thank you, Catherine, for that comment. That sort of speaks to sort of Catherine's comments here. Right. Okay. So more questions here. Some of these sort of very interesting. So anonymous attendee, thank you for this question about sort of VR being the next cool marketing fad. So it's certainly a sort of a concern here. So what's your response to that, Catherine?
I would agree that it is a bit of a worry. It's kind of been heralded as the next big thing for a while now. 10, 15 years, maybe more. And it's not become ubiquitous yet. And I think until it does, we aren't going to be able to use it in the way that I hope we can, essentially. I think from my experience, again, this is just anecdotal, this is just my experience of kind of talking to people who have created content, use VR in the kind of the environment and climate NGO world, essentially, is that there was a big push a few years ago, essentially, and there was a definite feeling of not wanting to be left behind, because certain NGOs are putting out this content and then others can.
Oh, Catherine, I think we've just lost you with your audio there. I think it sounded like your mic just dropped in sort of a connection. No, no, we've not got you, but that's while you try and get to that, I'm going to sort of raise some of these really interesting sort of comments. We've got a lot of interesting questions and chat happening as well. So John has come back around the public opinion in the US lagging behind Europe. I guess the sort of outsiders here in the UK, I guess we can sort of concur with that. That certainly seems to be the impression, but hopefully things are changing for the better. Let's come on to, yeah, we've had another question on moving responsibility for tackling climate change, which also hopefully we've sort of covered that off now. I'll take one of these questions on changing behaviours in specific areas. So has your research found that VR is particularly effective in changing behaviours in diet, travel, or recycling? Whilst Catherine gets her mic back. So we actually have a really interesting project happening around travel behaviour being led by my colleague Charisma Chowdhury in Institute for Transport Studies, where she's looking at future travel modes. So the flying cars and the like, and how that might sort of bias behaviour towards different particular sort of strategies. So we're in sort of early stages of this type of project, but it's a type of question that you simply couldn't ask in any other sort of medium. So, you know, actually experiencing what a flying car is like and comparing that to train travel is just a sort of, you know, left to sort of the imagination of participants, but you can start to bring that to life with virtual reality and then sort of get a more accurate representation, hopefully, of what people are actually likely to do. With sort of when presented with two different sort of unknown choices. So yeah, so this work is happening. We've got sort of amazing work happening in psychology on diet and sort of behavior. So actually the head of psychology, Jason Halford's been working on this for weight loss, looking at sort of how you can present perhaps really good for you food that isn't quite visually sort of appealing, and you can whether sort of change some of that presentation to sort of make that more appealing as well. In the same way that Catherine sort of presented earlier on about how you can move objects around in a supermarket to sort of bias behaviour. So it's very much around that work. Catherine, do we have you back? No, we don't. Oh, well, actually, it's probably not a bad thing because we're at 6:59 now, so we're about to wrap up anyway. So yeah, apologies about the sort of technical issues. Yeah, Adrian, yeah, probably mic unplugged, but we're probably not going to be able to fix it in the next minute or so. So it's probably a good time for us to wrap up this presentation. Yeah, no problem, Catherine, these things happen. You got through all the hard bits with the videos and the polls and everything. So anyway, no, it's been great. Yeah, fantastic. Sorry, we've not been able to get through all of these other sort of questions and some of the pre-submitted ones. There really were sort of yeah, a whole bunch of interesting discussions that we could have and continue to have. And hopefully you'll be able to sort of engage with us after this sort of a webinar series as well. So we'll send around the contact details for Catherine and the rest of our speakers as well. So I'm just going to say thank you again, Catherine. Fantastic. You know, you can't respond back, so that's okay. But yeah, thank you again for such a fantastic and sort of thought-provoking talk about the potential of VR for some really important sort of decisions facing humanity, I guess we sort of put it in those grand terms. And remind everyone that there are sort of 3 other sort of seminar series. If you haven't sort of caught those, they will be on YouTube, and our team will be sharing those links in the coming days. So if you've liked the taste of this, you want to hear a little bit more about Immersive at the university, please check those out. And all that's left for me to do now is to thank the audience and thank all the people asking questions. Really fun chat today, and for the last couple of weeks I've really enjoyed myself, and I hope you guys have too. So there's the link for the previous sort of seminars, and yeah, do check them out and get in touch with the centre if you're interested in hearing about anything else that we've sort of we do. You'll be able to see that on the website, or if you want to talk a little bit more about the work that's being presented. So it's Immersive Tech at leeds.ac.uk, and I'm sure that'll come around in your emails in the next couple of days. So thank you and good night.